Now, for our first panel discussion, I would like to invite, the discussion will be on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in cultural leadership. So I would like to invite Lizzy Moriarty, who will moderate the discussion. She's an independent museum consultant and museum expert. Micah, Parzen, the CEO of Museum of U.S.A. Fletcher, the director of the Irish Museum of Modern Art, and Katsaridou, the director of MOMus-Thessaloniki Museum of Photography. Please have a seat. And the floor is yours, and your time is here.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here and speaking about museums and justice, and where leaders have to show up in this whole debate. So I'd like to introduce the panel to you, and then each one will speak for a few minutes on certain aspects. So we're looking at covering our organizations within and without, our collections and our audiences and our stakeholders with regards to cultural leadership and how equitable we can be. So we'd like to first hear from Micah Parzen, who's the CEO of the Museum of Us. What could be more inclusive than that word, in San Diego. So he has talked over the course of this conference about rethinking the collection and the concept of an anthropological museum in our inclusive societies today, going from the colonial era to represent human culture through multicultural perspectives. Micah will start us off with his thoughts on leading from within to develop DEIA practice within the organization. What personal qualities does it require? And he will touch on the budget as a moral document, particularly when it comes to DEIA work. And then after that, we will hear from Katsaridou, who's director of the Museum of Photography here, part of the MOMus group here in Thessaloniki. She will look at activism and neutrality. Are museums neutral? She will explain a particular case study on engaging the public on the subject of populism. And then finally, we'll hear from Fletcher, who has come from Ireland, representing as director the Irish Museum of Modern Art. So that exists to connect today's audiences with contemporary art through the collection, now and for the future. So Annie will give us her thoughts on rethinking the collection, and particularly the taxonomy of collections in the light of censorship and recuperation. Whose voices are represented in how we refer to the collection and how we derive meaning from it. So those are the subjects that we will be discussing in the next few minutes, and I'll just hand over to Micah to start us
Wonderful.
off.
Thank you, Lizzy, and good morning, everybody. Such a pleasure to be here with all of you and have such a warm welcome here in Greece, and especially to talk about a subject that's so near and dear to my heart, and I think all of our hearts, right? And all of your hearts in the audience as well. Because I think deep down we know that this is the future of our field. We need to respond, particularly to the younger generations who are coming up, whether it's in the U.S. or in Europe, who have a very different sensibility around many of the issues that we were all socialized into, particularly the binaries that we all think of as being natural, whether that's race or gender or sexual orientation. There's so much fluidity, and the kinds of things we're talking about today, I think, and in this conference more generally, are so obvious to young people. And as they come of age and become the visitors to museums of the future, they become the members of museums, they become donors, they become the trustees around the board table. We need to meet them in this place and really rise to the occasion of what they're going to be expecting out of our cultural institutions in the decades to come. Leadership in this space, of course, really is about setting the tone from the top. If your leader is not really bought in and committed to these types of issues, it won't stick in the culture at large in the organization. And I think that really begins with self-awareness, particularly for somebody like myself or many of us on this panel and in this conference who are white or white appearing and come from a place of privilege. Leadership is not just a privilege in itself, but it's also very much built on privilege. And until we begin to unpack what that looks like and the ways in which, as individuals, we have wielded that privilege in ways that could be harmful to others, whether knowingly or unknowingly, we can't really talk authentically about DEAI within the context of our organizations and within the context of the folks that we serve. This sort of journey of unpacking our own privilege, of course, is truly that, right? It's a journey. I can't tell you, I've been with the Museum of Us now, formerly the San Diego Museum of Man, for 13 years. And I think when I first started, I thought I got this type of work. I thought I understood how I was using my privilege. And I quickly learned that that wasn't so much the case. And it was the folks who were bringing a very different type of lived experience to the table, whether people of color, indigenous people, people with disabilities, who really helped me see that, helped me see that there were ways in which I was coming up short and not walking the talk. I think this type of work internally requires an extraordinary amount of grace and humility. We're constantly learning, we're constantly making mistakes. So I think you have to be extending that grace to yourself and certainly to others, and then hope that others will extend that grace to you as you continue down the path. And then as you continue to do better as you know better, really being willing to lead in this direction, which is critically important, and to lead with humility as well. It requires an enormous amount of courage to do so. I often refer to an article that came out in the Stanford Social Innovation Review within the past year or so, where the authors were examining the single most important characteristic of a leader for effectuating transformational change. And they studied all sorts of organizations, and ultimately they found that the most important characteristic of leadership in this space, and particularly with equity and inclusion, is moral courage. And the more I thought about it, the more I continue to come back to this idea that moral courage does not occur in a vacuum. You can't just stick your neck out and hope for the best and end up in pieces on the ground without a job. You're not going to be a very effective leader. So really asking these questions of what are the conditions that are necessary for you to be able to extend this kind of moral courage? What kind of ecosystem do you need? What kind of garden do you have to sort of tend to? And in the United States, there's really two factors that I think probably apply to many of you folks in the institutions you work for as well. I report to a board of directors of 21 individuals, and when I first joined the board, joined the museum, the board looked very different than it does today. It generally consisted of older, white, wealthy, educated males who had a particular agenda and a vision of what the museum should look like. But over time, and it took us years to do this, we adopted a sort of litmus test for who could join our board. And that litmus test was, you can't be the smartest person in the room to join the board. And we said that sort of tongue-in-cheek because no matter how smart you are, no matter how much value you're adding, if you are taking up all of the air in the room, if you are dominating the conversation with your lived experience and your voice, you are never going to add as much value as sort of the collective beehive of wisdom when you bring diverse voices and lived experience around the table. So we began to sort of bless and release folks and have them find the door either voluntarily or maybe not so voluntarily sometimes, and we began to bring very different type of people around the decision-making table, both on the leadership team, the museum at large, but I think most importantly on the board itself. And as we gradually did that, we gradually changed the organization as well. There were very different kinds of conversations, there was active dialogue, different types of perspectives, and most importantly, different lived experience that came to the fore, which led us to really talk about things in a very different way, ask very different types of questions, define our values and our priorities in very different types of ways. So that was huge in sort of setting the stage for myself as a leader to really be morally courageous and to push boundaries. These were folks around the board table who really could appreciate that this type of work is very messy, and I'm sure we'll hear that with all of my colleagues. You are holding space for decades, if not centuries, of intergenerational trauma. And when you do that, all sorts of things start to come out, and it's messy work, and it's difficult work and challenging work, but it's also where the magic kind of occurs, right? It's where people start to feel heard and valued and seen in a very different type of way, and they start to contribute to your organization in ways that you couldn't even think about before because of the paradigm you were operating within that really centers a sort of white dominant narrative voice. So changing the board changed the museum and set us down a path. The other kind of component of that for us, really setting the stage for us to exhibit the kind of moral courage that it took to go down this path, was to shift our organizational culture in many ways. So that again, there are no smartest people in the room, right? We're all coming to the table with this sense of humility, with an ethos of curiosity, with an understanding that we have so much to learn from each other, right? And the more that we hear things that are outside of our echo chamber, that aren't preaching to the choir, that challenge our assumptions, we have to work through things sometimes, right? It can be uncomfortable, but we have to sort of sit in that discomfort and really allow ourselves to listen in very deep ways that begin again to sort of change the conversation. So we started bringing very different people into the organization, not just on the board, but also on the team, right? And eventually over time, and it took a significant amount of time, but the organization began to radically shift in these equity and inclusion, accessibility spaces. Lizzy mentioned this sort of idea that the budget has to be a moral document, right? Which I think is a very, very powerful framing. Our field is so fraught with performative aspects. And when I say performative, I mean there's a lot of talk about equity and inclusion and diversity and accessibility, but when the hard work comes and things get messy, people often jump ship, right? And they run the other way, and they're unable to sort of be consistent with the high and mighty missions and visions that their organizations espouse and the actions that they're actually taking. Well, focusing on your budget as a moral document that really reflects your values, right? Not just that you're saying these things are important to you, but that you actually put money into the budget. You put money where your mouth is. You have specific line items that support this kind of work. You have a larger sort of bucket of monies too, because due to the fact that this type of work is so messy, you always have issues come up, right? So this is critically important of really walking the talk in ways that aren't just performative, but really translate into specific actions, right? Really holding ourselves accountable, particularly when we are coming from a very privileged perspective, really unpacking what that looks like, coming up with concrete action plans, coming up with budgets that really support that, allows you to move the work down the path.
That's really important, I think, is, it's resourcing. And we are in a cultural sector which is always under-resourced. Yeah. So those moral decisions made around budget are very, very key. Thank you very much, Micah. That's really a good start. Now we'll move over to Iro, who will talk to us more about audiences and engaging audiences in some of these very difficult subjects. We'd love to hear about your experience.
Thank you. Thank you, Lizzy, for this, and thank you, Micah, for all your thoughts for leadership. They are always in my mind. I mean, I would like to start from the title of our conference today, Justice, Museums and Justice. And when we are discussing the role of leadership in this, for me at least, it is a challenge. Our institution, it is the MOMus Museum of Photography, which is one of the 5 museums of the Metropolitan Organization of Museum of Visual Arts here in Thessaloniki, and one in Athens, I would say. Is an organization that was established 5 years ago, starting with a decision to join forces, which means that already from its foundation, our institution is talking about inclusion and diversity. When someone is placing social justice in the core mission of one's institution, I think we should talk about relevance, and this is relevance of practices to the community that an institution serves. And for museums, in order to be relevant, we have to somehow reconsider the the current status of alleged neutrality. This is a heritage from the Enlightenment, we all know that. But it's said to add to the authority and the objectivity of the institution. However, recently, or not so recently, I would say, more and more voices are calling for museums to take a stand against neutrality and in favor of radical shifts in social concern. I always think of Donna Haraway and her. It is old by now, it is written in 1988, Situated Knowledge, which she says that there is no neutral position. This view from above, from nowhere, is non-existent. And every knowledge is created from a critical positioning and within specific ideological, historical, and theoretical contexts. This is an ethically perspective, of course, which is described by recent theorists as museum activism. Much talk has been done about that, so I won't elaborate more on that, but I'll try to focus on what we do at our institution. Indeed, in the light of the recent crisis over a decade now in Greece and all around the world, my colleagues and I have been trying to take position towards socio-political issues. This is a general stance of ours, and it informs the entire agenda of all our activities. And this includes exhibition scheduling, exhibition programming, that focuses mostly on civic engagement. The recent example is the main exhibition of our Thessaloniki Photo Biennale. It is currently on view. If you have time, I would love for you to visit it, but I know that you're flying tonight, so okay. It is an exhibition that treats the theme of populism, a highly disputed and I would say very current theme. It is called the exhibition The Spectre of People. It is curated by the British art historian Julian Stalabras, who has done much work on the issue. It tries through photography and lens-based art video to treat several aspects of populism, which by itself it's an elusive concept, as it spans the divide between left and right, and also the divide between mass participation and authoritarian rule. The exhibition tries to answer, I would say, some questions like how and if we are to represent the people. How is the nature of the charismatic leaders, and how also we could represent protest, public protest and insurgency. It is international in its view, with artists participating from countries such as Brazil, Greece, of course, Poland, the Philippines, of course, the UK, the US, Italy, Ukraine, I said so, yes, sorry. And Julian's exhibition is actually, I would say it tries to activate the public's viewership. It is an engagement with real issues, having photography as a starting point. And the exhibition was highly covered by the media, and we hoped it did urge a public discussion. It is accompanied by, of course, a public program like masterclasses, artist talks, participatory drama workshops, and pop-up events all around the city. Because the main issue of its mission is to activate citizenship, because it is the main issue that when we are doing an exhibition on populism and democracy, it is something that we should have in mind. And I won't burden you more with talking about. I can answer a question if you wish. But while hearing all the greetings and Micah's address earlier, one issue came to my mind, the word commitment and the word value. And for us, for me, and the Museum of Photography, and MOMus in general, I think the true commitment is the responsibility that we are having towards our community. And this is a moral issue too, I think, because you are talking about the budget, and it is a moral document. Indeed, I totally agree.
Thank you very much, Iro, and looking forward to asking a few questions about that. Annie, very interested to hear from you about the collection's role in equality. How are you tackling that?
Thank you so much. Well, I can kind of, in a way, relate it to both of these wonderful starting points from my panelists beside me. I was thinking about this Donna Haraway sort of quote and the idea of, this false notion of museums being neutral or autonomous somehow, or extracted from the world. And I was thinking of another quote from a wonderful academic, Irit Rogoff, who says, "You can't have a position without a location." And I think this is really interesting in terms of actually leaning into the idea that we need to be located specifically and precisely where we are. Absolutely thinking globally, but also understanding the conditions in which we operate. And also just to lean into what Micah said about the budget as a kind of moral document, I think that's really interesting, and what influences me about the collection is understanding that if we are merely performative, and I mean, obviously there's a lot to be said for performativity and temporary programming, but actually insisting on building a permanent archive, creating a memory, committing to possibly even changing the fabric of the museum itself by leaning into a much more diverse and exciting collection, is for me a way of kind of structurally embedding kind of creative practice and the catalyst for change within the DNA of the actual museum. So I think, well, a lot of contemporary art museums, my own included, often function in this very excited kind of neoliberal presentism of always looking for the new. Our imperative as museums is to collect, is to create the archive. And I think that's a deeply political role, and it's a deeply inclusive role, because it allows one to understand one's history, one's location, one's sense of urgency, but also if one leans into kind of leading with courage, and it allows one to, and humility, it allows one to perhaps speculate on what might be overdetermined histories or fixed histories or majoritized histories, which we know are often violent to those that are excluded. And there's something, deeply important about critiquing that majority kind of culture or that majority kind of overdetermined history by adding and including and making much more diverse. So that's something that we really think about a lot in the museum, and not only putting our money where our mouth is and actively buying in different ways, but then spending a lot of time trying to think about how do we account for these practices. Perhaps we're not the experts, so changing the kind of expertise we bring in, changing the kind of language, changing the kind of accessibility and description definitions and taxonomies around which we might understand what is an important artwork for the 21st century. So it's a really exciting journey, but one that is actively trying to think about a kind of corrective to the erased histories, but also a kind of an active and courageous journey with the publics about understanding who we are by reconsidering our collections, rethinking them, questioning certain assumed narratives. And I think it's not only being maybe having a kind of humility, but it's daring to speculate. I think that's where the courage is. You know, I think this wonderful description earlier of the 3 times of museums, you know, museums as modernist sort of educational edifices had a sense of authority. And I think now we're having the courage to sort of talk about the idea that we have definitely got expertise, we've got passion, we've got skills, but we might need to understand that our own narrative is not the only one, and to gatekeep that narrative is actually quite damaging. So it is about daring to speculate with others, or to accept the criticism. What I talked about the other day is accept the loyal opposition, accept the activists or those who feel excluded, and listen to that and allow that to kind of impact on how one might change. So to that end, I suppose I have 2 very quick examples of what we're kind of trying to lean into in the museum. We recently opened an exhibition called Self-Determination, a very sort of poignant term right now in the world. But it was really to look at the history of Ireland. It's caught in a very interesting sort of process of commemoration since Ireland became independent with the beginning really in 1916 and right through the War of Independence and the Civil War, all kinds of painful and difficult histories. We've been thinking about how to commemorate thoughtfully this very traumatic and conflicted history. And so we've actually created a show which absolutely leans into our collection but rereads it globally. So really tries to think beyond the kind of very fixed history in which it was always located. I call it the sort of Anglo bracket of America and Britain, in a way. This is where Ireland sort of understood itself often. And it was a very exciting show to kind of dare to not always just look for the new, but actually reread the history with these extraordinary collections from Poland, from Ukraine, from Finland. We were looking at the interwar period and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the redrawing of other empires, of course, in that period. So it was a real moment of moments, and I thought it would be so exciting for us. We didn't have the answers, but we wanted to explore what it might have felt like for Ireland to be in that global noisy moment of moments with many other nations who are choosing to define themselves again as states in various ways. So it's an enormously kind of revealing moment. I'm sure we've got things wrong, and I'm dying to hear the criticism, but I think that's what you can do. You can retell, and you have to have the courage to tell stories with the archive again and again. So that's really what I think, to my mind, it's the DNA of the museum, is the collection and how you use it.
Thank you very much, Annie. I think there's some unifying themes coming out, and that is, acknowledging what we don't know and looking at where the power lies. And you're talking about redressing that balance. Micah talking about it from a staff and sort of decision making, who's making the decisions, and you're sort of being aware of what we don't know and not being the authoritative museums that were born in the 18th and 19th century. And Iro, you're talking about sort of enabling the whole debate within society again, and perhaps museums are sort of thinking about being that space for difficult decisions. So I'm curious to hear really from all of you a little bit of dialogue within our conversation here about the power balance and what does that mean in an equitable society and museums' role in enabling that. I don't know, does anybody have particular thoughts on that, this idea of power?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment a little bit. I mean, this is scary stuff, right? Like ceding your authority, giving up your power. that we've all held so near and dear for so long. I mean, that's the basis of museums, is that we have this authoritative expertise, and we then share that with the public in sort of often, at least historically, ways that have been very unquestioned. And now that they're getting challenged, that yes, that's one perspective, and it presents the world in a certain way, but there are a lot of other types of ways to understand the world and other lived experience that comes into play. And in fact, you know, Anna, you said something that I thought was so powerful. You know, you can't have a position without a location, right? So that question of no matter who you are and where you work, what is the harm that has occurred in your site where you work? You know, for us, it is the indigenous land that was taken from the Kumeyaay peoples, the Native Americans who existed on that land since time immemorial, and how do we begin to bring them into the fold in ways that really cede our authority and our expertise and make space and really privilege and honor their perspective. So I think it's a complete flipping of the script of this power dynamic, and being willing to be vulnerable in that kind of way and make space for others and really learn from them.
Yeah, it's a complicated balance, isn't it? Because it's also, you know, we have the buildings, we have the resources, so it's not like we're ceding all of it, but we're trying to deploy it in maybe more transparent ways. And I think what was very nice about what you said earlier about this idea of understanding one's privilege and one's power, but understanding the responsibility that is with that. I mean, for us, what was quite interesting was getting all of the curators within the museum to tell stories with the collection. They were very used to having this power, but somehow pushing the artist forward to do it for them. Whereas in one way, it's actually acknowledging the power, leaning into what it gives you, but being prepared to take risks and acknowledge one's responsibility also.
Yeah. Really about self-awareness, whether as an individual or as an institution.
Yeah.
I think I share your thoughts about responsibility, and I think this is the most important thing for our institution too. I mean, during the last decade, it is the crisis period for Greece. The Museum of Photography has been, even long before my appointment there, they have been working with photography for political issues. They've been hugely involved in that, in the refugee crisis, or the hyper-capitalist practices and their effects, or fake news. And the public program that accompanies all these exhibitions was really engaging. I mean, it included photography classes for young refugees and their exploration of the city, or other youth projects, or programs in prisons. I think that our institution has, it is the main field that it has thrived. This engagement with the community and with the special groups, and it is very in tune with what I think a museum is. It is a par excellence social space, a space for social intervention, and this is what we do.
And are you seeing that in how your audience, the sort of makeup of your audiences, and how they're responding to you as a?
Yeah, I think this is the general impression that, and what we got as from the public. I mean, yes. The feedback we get from them.
Yeah, that's changing, and yeah. It's interesting to see how with that invitation, things start happening, and it builds its own momentum, and we have to trust that process. It's a sort of transitory, and acknowledging that is also sometimes difficult, because we are permanent institutions rooted in the past, and we've got to project forward to the future.
I'm reminded, the term that I really like is from Chantal Mouffe, where she talks about agonistic spaces, not antagonistic spaces, but agonistic. And I think that's really interesting, to become more confident about operating in that complex space, because, you know, we're no longer just history-making machines. We have to allow for this kind of complex conversation.
Yeah, I think this type of work really brings up an enormous amount for the visitor, no matter who that person is. You know, if it's somebody who's from an unrepresented community or historically marginalized community, they may be seeing themselves represented in that institution or any institution really for the first time. For people who are interested in being allies in this space, it sort of brings up things related to how do they do better. And for folks who have never really thought about these issues before, it can trigger really sort of deep-seated feelings, sometimes of feeling threatened or defensive. And so the role of the institution, I think, also is to really hold space for the things that come up for people when you start to really be political and take a stand and be very clear about what point you're trying to make instead of hide under a mask of neutrality.
Yes, and I think you're absolutely right, and we're only really just beginning to explore this social role and our responsibility in it, and the whole sort of psychosocial area has specialisms within it. We need to find organizations and the expertise to help us hold that space as public institutions. Yeah, I'm interested as well to sort of explore a little bit about how your institution, how you see the institutions changing. This is, transitory space, and the whole thing doesn't have an end. And we're so used to thinking as human beings of achieving something. Everything has an outcome, but actually this transition is the outcome. And the transition in society, these transitions that we want, more equality, how do you see the role that you're playing in that as leaders in equitable institutions?
Well, I mean, on some levels, yes, one is always in transition because new urgencies arise, but also, as we all know, we have to fight for resources where, it's a challenge. There's so much to be done in the realm of diversity and accessibility. I spend more time worrying about seating and stairs and all kinds of things than I do actually about art. There's so much to do. So I don't know if I ever imagined the success or what the success looks like yet. I wish I could say that, but it's an important journey.
Well, yes, I find myself in the same position, I would say. But another thing that I would like to share with you is that I believe in collective schemes. And although, I'm the leader there, or somehow I'm the director, I do believe in collective leadership. And my colleagues and I are working all the time for all the decisions that have to be made somehow. Otherwise, we are very limited team, but otherwise we won't do the job that we need to do, And I would like to comment on what Annie earlier said about the museum, the role of museums, and we're not history-making machines, of course. I like that very much. And I think we are talking about the present, and we are engaging with, we are creating the present somehow. And this is our responsibility for our society and our community.
Yes, and bringing our stakeholders to the understanding of what that really means, and what that means in terms of social investment. I don't know, going back to the budget as a moral document, and funders might not necessarily see that because they are outcome focused. So have you found ways of articulating that so that it lands and you get some sort of positive feedback from stakeholders?
Yeah, we've had to also bless and release many of our donors, right, who just aren't capable of really holding space for this type of messy work, and they want very clear outcomes, and don't want us to be sort of truthful and honest about how messy the work really is. But there's a huge shift going on in the United States, at least, regarding philanthropy and more trust-based philanthropy that is really about the work that's being done and belief in the leaders and giving them a lot of flexibility and space to sort of do what they need to do. And so while that's a very long arc and change is slow in that regard, it is very much happening in certain circles. And I, again, believe that in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, that will be much more the norm than it is today.
Yes, and I think we've got different sort of levels of philanthropy, and one of the sort of stakeholders that we have in terms of governments who are who are looking at the social development, the responsibilities they have for that, and the role of culture in that, I think, is an area that, as leaders, we need to sort of articulate some of these incredible things that we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need to understand our soft power and maybe even our hard power, but I think time is absolutely very important to give this time, this great, new, exciting experiment.
Yeah, and there's a whole sort of global dimension to that as well. You were talking about, Annie, the kind of global representation and sort of recalibrating what that means.
Yeah, I mean, we've just released our new strategy, which is to be a catalyst for change, radically public, but also a global connector. And I think for me, the issue, you know, it's not to be kind of romantically global and or encyclopedic somehow, that one can somehow just collect all these relations, but it again is to understand the cultural traffic of one's location, and to seek comparatives and dialogues that allow one to kind of also blow up that kind of majority overdetermined narrative, you know, to allow one to kind of question and reflect on one's changing community, of course, which is increasingly global and more diverse. And that change is very recent, of course, in Ireland in comparison to other places. But so I think it's sort of thinking very thoughtfully about what those global connections are is really absolutely vital for the museum.
Yes. Well, I think that is a very good note to end on in terms of we are a global audience here. We have our online global audience, and thank you all very much for your insights today. Thank you.
Thank you all.